You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Brian Platzer.
Authors. I have a fantastic new service to tell you about. It's called PubSite. PubSite is a service to help you build your very own website, your home on the web, where you can promote your work and give your fans a place to connect with you. PubSite is a website platform that allows every author, regardless of budget, to have a great-looking professional website. Developed by the book marketing professionals at FSB Associates. PubSite is the new, easy-to-use DIY website builder developed specifically for books and authors. Whether you're an author of one book or 20, or a small publisher, PubSite allows you to build, design, and most importantly, update your website pain-free. No need to be dependent on a designer or webmaster to make a small but costly change to your website. Save the money and do it yourself. PubSite is the best platform for authors because it's a book-centric platform. PubSite was built just for authors and small publishers. Every design, feature, and layout is book-centric. They have customized designs for you to use. It's easy to build. No coding or HTML is necessary to create a stunning, professional-looking website with all the features you want. Get a custom domain name, yourname.com. It's simple to update. You can add all of your books, add a blog and a book tour, sell from any retailer, manage your email list and social media, and even do e-commerce. Build your website with a 14-day free trial, then pay just $19.99 per month, which includes hosting. And we offer packages starting at $499 to set up the website for you. Pub-site.com, the place to help authors find their home on the web. The Feisty Heroine romance collection of short stories. Over 30 plus pulse racing shorts to capture your heart with USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and award-winning authors in the mix. Paranormal, contemporary, fantasy, and historical romance that will whet your appetite with titillating, heart-pounding tales you'll want to read again, then beg for more. Fall in love with your next book crush. Pre-order this amazing collection of shorts, over 30 pulse-pounding stories for only 99 cents.
Proceed with caution. Buying this collection may lead to addictive reading, falling in love with your next book crush, and staying up past your bedtime to see what happens next.
Get your limited edition copy of Feisty Heroines. Look for the link in the show notes of this episode. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Brian Platzer on the show with me today. He has a brand new novel just released a couple of days ago. It's called The Body Politic. And let me tell you what, if there was ever a timely book for the world we're living in now, it is this one. Welcome to the show, Brian.
I'm so pleased to be here. Big fan of the show and have been really looking forward to chatting.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, if you've listened to the show before, you know that we kick off each episode with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a...
It's funny you ask. I was thinking about that the other day in anticipation of this conversation. And I think the first time I ever thought about being a storyteller was on my way to being dropped off from my first summer at overnight camp. And I was a nervous kid. I was scared of a lot of things. And I must have been agitated in the car. I remember my father telling me, like, no pressure, you don't need to do anything that you don't want to do. Just promise me you'll come home with a couple of great stories. And he must have delivered that line as sort of a casual throw off, like, don't worry about it, have a good time, this will be great, like, we'll be able to laugh at the end. But I remember taking it as an order, and I remember for 4 weeks being away from home, like being worried I didn't yet have the story that my father was expecting, and where was I going to get it? And then I started trying to do different activities to try to set myself up in wacky situations, and it was obviously all in my head. My father just wanted to give me a hug when I got home and hear how it was. But that's definitely, I was probably 11 or 12 years old. And that was when I started thinking about storytelling as something that I wanted to think about, or I couldn't stop thinking about, and putting together, the events of my real life and trying to make entertainment out of them.
I love that so much. Was that an atypical thought from your dad, or was that kind of in line with his personality?
No, I think it was in line with his personality. He is a lawyer who never loved being a lawyer and always had a performative aspect to his regular conversation. And I don't think he meant anything, as I say, serious about it, but it must have been something in my 11-year-old brain that combined the combination of knowing my father enjoyed telling a story and him tasking me with the same, opportunity. I think I inadvertently took it way too seriously.
That's so funny. That is so funny. I was one of those kids too that took, like, if someone gave me an order or suggestion like that, I took it to heart, and I've got to do this. And then, when you ask them about it later or try to report in, they're like, what are you talking about? They don't even remember saying that to you.
And I think that's probably a not uncommon for writers, where we almost feel like there's a consequence to returning with the correct information, or information that will make people happy, or there's definitely a desire to please that I think drives a lot of us to spend all our time alone in our rooms making up stories to entertain people.
And little did we know that that would become a thing with editors later in life. Exactly. They really are waiting for us to report in with this thing.
Exactly.
We promised we could make
That's a funny comparison. You're right, because there's that same idea with editors that I now, as an adult, imbue them with almost magical qualities, where, my editor was looking for more kindness in that section, or this isn't moving as quickly. But like, the editor is just a man or woman in a room making suggestions, just like my father was just a guy in a car asking me for something. But it absolutely does come forward with that same degree of importance and seriousness as when I was a kid talking to my father.
Oh, I remember the first short story anthology that I wrote a piece for, and thinking that looking at the feedback from the editor, and pouring over all of the suggestions and thinking, oh my God, how am I going to reconcile all of this?
Exactly.
And then when I talked to her later, she was like, they were just suggestions.
Right. It's just someone like after lunch, before a nap, like trying to make a story a little bit better. But I take it as gospel in the same way as I guess you did.
That's so funny. That is so funny. Were you a big reader as a kid?
Not until I got a little older. I mean, I was a good student, so I did the assigned homework and did it as well as I could. But I don't think I started reading for pleasure until late in high school, when I had commutes on the subway to and from school, and my homework was getting a little bit too complicated, and the idea, to do it on the train, and the idea of escaping into a world, a little bit of a parallel universe, I think is something that a lot of high school students feel. And I definitely began to feel a draw towards the sort of literary fiction that I write now, which is just like people who seem like more or less real people, and getting deeper into their actions, their thoughts, why they do the things they're doing. It unlocked a universe that I probably wasn't socially aware enough to have conversations in the way that a lot of other kids did, in sophomore, junior year of high school. So I tried to get as much of that understanding of what people are and why they act in the way they do out of books.
Right. Well, since you brought up literary fiction, there are how do I say this? There are definite ideas about what literary fiction is, and people have a response to that. People think that because something is literary, it can't be commercial or it can't be any fun. And part of that probably comes down to our later high school and college education, and the things that tend to be in curriculum, and it's just no fun, in
Absolutely.
a lot of cases.
People think of literary fiction as the fiction that they're assigned to read, as opposed to the work that they gravitate towards itself. I am of two minds when it comes to the expression literary fiction. I think it has, in some ways, a bad rap because people were assigned books and they just, in their mind, they say, well, Moby Dick was exhausting and I had to force myself through the first half, then I stopped reading, and the thought of paying to go through an experience like that sounds horrifying. But on the other side, I think that writers of what some people call genre fiction are appropriately upset by not being included in the literary fiction basket, because some people think that it's judged as less high-minded. I think when I use the term, I used it accidentally earlier, but I appreciate you pushing me on it. When I use the term, I think I write literary fiction because I don't know how to write genre fiction. I think that if I had mastered, a real good mystery, or if I was able to write a thriller that I thought was thrilling, or a romance that I found satisfying in that way, I would probably be writing that. But what interests me in the world is what people are thinking as they go about their regular life. And I sort of believe in petty gossip as a valuable enterprise, because it's like what I talk to my friends about, like, why do you think he did that? Or I can't believe she did this. And I think the job of a novelist is to take that sort of conversation out of the realm of the mundane and create a plot that is exhilarating and exciting, and people want to find out what happens next, and every action needs to reverberate, create consequences in the next action. But when it comes down to it, I'm just fascinated with what people are really thinking versus what they say they're thinking or what they present to the world as thinking. So that feels like more of the realm of what people refer to as literary fiction than some woman trying to solve a mystery or some guy trying to see if the world's going to explode. In my mind, what I am better at and what I am personally drawn to are stories of trying to figure out the reasons why human beings act the way they do within the contours of exciting, socio-political events, or sexual relationships, or marriages, or parenting, or just the moments that maybe are a little bit exaggerated, but that feel relatable to a common reader.
Well, and at the end of the day, what we really want to connect with is the human experience. And, there are great genre fiction books that entertain, and that are maybe very plot driven, and we enjoy those. And there's definitely a place for a great mystery or, whatever. But we don't always return back to those books, back to the well, if you will, to find more meaning. But a great character driven book, those are things that we might read over and over again, and it just resonates differently. And there, definitely authors who can do both, that can have a great plot, but, have characters that we care about. And
I think I agree entirely. And I think the best authors do both, whether they are marketed primarily as, fiction writers, or mystery writers, or literary fiction writers, or I don't think that matters. I think the best writers are the ones who do combine an element of engaging story with real, alive people. And that's what I try to do. And I think that's what most writers try to do. I think also a word that you used earlier is entertainment. I think that when it comes down to it, we're all just entertainers, all types of writers. I think that maybe I entertain in a slightly more psychological way than maybe other entertainers. But I think that we get stuck in this, to differentiate what is, more artistic writing or literary writing or boring writing. Or I think these are all different phrases with negative and positive connotations. But basically, we're all trying to, people spend their money to read these books when they aren't, doing the tasks like working their jobs or raising kids. And it's our job to present them with something that they feel is a entertaining and worthwhile experience.
Right. You said that you gravitated toward the types of books that you're writing now, that you became a fan of literary fiction. Do you remember what the first book or maybe the first author that you read that just kind of lit your brain on fire?
Yeah, James Baldwin blew me away. I picked up a novel. I literally picked up a novel on the subway. I had never heard of James Baldwin before, never heard of the book Giovanni's Room, but it was short and it was sitting next to me on a subway bench. And I picked it up. It was the most incredible thing I've ever read. I still return to it and teach it when I can. But it's a book by James Baldwin, who is a master storyteller who spent most of his career writing about race in America. But this book is about a white guy goes to Paris, is engaged to a woman, falls in love with a man who is tending bar at a bar he accidentally begins to frequent, and about how his life is torn between the path of getting married in the way he was thinking of, and the possibility of being gay and what it meant to his masculinity and what it meant to his life in general. And I, at the time, was, a 16-year-old straight virgin who didn't know anything about any of this. But the combination of seeing Paris in that way and seeing these worlds I wasn't privy to at that age, but understanding all of the emotions and thoughts in a way that I did understand was revelatory to me. The idea that I could follow the thoughts and feelings of somebody who's experiencing something so different from what I experience, but with a vocabulary that helped me articulate emotions and experiences that I myself was experiencing as a 16-year-old kid in New York. I've been hungry for that same feeling ever since, and have found it more or less successfully over the, 20, 30 years since I was that kid. But I do remember it as just a revelation, that book.
Wow. You went on to go to college to, I know you got your master's degree. What did you study? What was your major?
So, undergraduate, I discovered that I could spend all my time in small classrooms with professors reading books that they thought a lot about. And that was all I did. I tried to limit myself just to small seminar classes discussing fiction with professors. I ended up majoring in French literature and English literature and minoring in creative writing. And then I went and I got an MFA in fiction from Johns Hopkins in grad school.
There are delineations of people that love the MFA program and find that it just adds to their creativity and unlocks their potential, and then some people that are not so fond of it. Was it a good experience for you?
Overall, it was a necessary experience for me. I was lucky in that Hopkins was a funded program, which meant I had to teach one class, but other than that, all I needed to do was focus on writing. So I agree with the myriad of criticisms of the MFA program, especially in the lack of tools that a typical workshop gives its students, where a writing workshop, which is at the core of a lot of these programs, becomes a performance piece to impress teachers and criticize the other writers. And it's especially in a group of people who tend to be in their mid-20s, who tend to be drinking too much, who tend to not have the self-confidence or perspective that we do as older. It gets vicious. And I think that's not Hopkins at all specific. I think that's across the board. There's a contest nature to the workshop, which is as detrimental as it can be useful. That being said, having 2 years as a pre-professional program where I needed to figure out how to dedicate the few hours to writing every day as well as time to teaching was a miracle. And I wouldn't be able to have created that sort of architecture for myself when I came back to the real world as a school teacher initially, trying to carve out time to write as well as to teach and to tutor. It taught me how to write and edit myself. And the other things it did was provide me with a couple of classmates who are still my first readers of everything I write, all the fiction and nonfiction. And finally, I got to work with Alice McDermott, who is a writer I hadn't read before I went to the program, and whose fiction now is slower than mine and way more Catholic and interested in nuns than mine is. And I wouldn't have sought her out myself. But she is not only a literary, but a pedagogical genius, where she ran workshops in a way where every second was a valuable teaching experience for everybody in that room. And she didn't do the sort of thing where, a lot of people in workshop end up feeling, where like one guy's like, I'd like to hear more about the father. And somebody else is like, I hated the father, and then you go home and you don't know what to do with the father. She had a series of almost items to check off a list that she would make sure all of us did in our work, which I've internalized since then, from, establishing a present tense and the perspective from which you're telling the story, getting the characters in a scene immediately, making sure the reader knows what a character wants immediately, setting up the obstacle to what the character wants, and then creating a world of inevitability where the decision the character makes and the attempt to achieve that character's goal has an immediate effect on everybody else in that character's life and how they try to affect their goals. So even though that sounds a little bit color by number, and I wouldn't ever think of a successful novel as always following those rules, spending 3 semesters with Alice McDermott and learning to internalize those rules, which then I could create variations from or fight against or ignore when I wanted to, but internalizing that was as valuable a internship essentially as anything I could have imagined.
Right. Your first book, Bed-Stuy Is Burning. When did you start writing that, and where did this story come from?
So 10, 11 years ago, my wife and I knew we were going to have kids, and we wanted to see if we could buy a house because all our money was going into rent and we didn't have much money. And we sort of stumbled on the fact that because I think pretty much only because of racially insensitive views of people who lived in Manhattan, primarily white people who were in Manhattan and then out in Brooklyn, there were these beautiful buildings in the neighborhood of Bed-Stuy that if we took out a giant loan from the bank and borrowed money from all of our friends and family, we could put down a small down payment and we could live in the middle 2 floors and immediately rent out the top floor and the bottom floor to offset the mortgage and buy ourselves a house. So we came into this neighborhood, 2 white people in our, early 30s who didn't know as much about the neighborhood as we probably should have, and went through this experience where we simultaneously fell in love with the neighborhood and had neighbors for the first time who cared about us and eventually our kids. The buildings are beautiful, the blocks are tree-lined, etc. But we naively, at least I naively, stumbled into this world that was dealing with the pressures of gentrification in a way that I wasn't prepared to fully understand. So I was getting dirty looks from some people as I was walking around and sort of hearty welcomes from others. I remember I was teaching 8th grade primarily at the time, and my walk on the way to the subway every morning, I started to see kids not much older than the kids I was teaching, shackled in handcuffs up against the fence that separates the stairs up the street from those down to the subway. Every single morning, they were being stopped and frisked and questioned and pushed up against that fence. And it was clearly fraught to the degree that it was unsustainable, where the kids who were being stopped and frisked every morning were mortified and embarrassed and angry. The police officers didn't want to be doing this every morning. They were going about their job, but this wasn't fun for them. And the commuters, black, white, Hispanic, all of us for whom this was ostensibly done, we were mortified. And like, we didn't want this to be done on our behalf. So I would start seeing people trying to interrupt and try to, negotiate. And then the police officers would say, stop getting in our way. And the kids would get even more embarrassed. And it was just such an awful situation that I tried to imagine what would happen if one or two things went wrong. And I ended up being obsessed with this idea of writing a story from the perspective of the local kids whose lives were being changed by gentrification and the police presence that followed, the police officers doing this job, the gentrifiers who are new to the neighborhood, the people who had been living in the neighborhood for generations, the people who are now priced out of the neighborhood because people like I have come in, and then rent, increased, and people who have for generations been living in a African-American neighborhood and being among friends and family all of a sudden were forced out. So I did, a year or two of academic research and interviews to try to figure out what as many people were thinking as possible, and to try to, check the characters I was writing against their lived experience. And then I came out with this novel, Bed-Stuy Is Burning, which takes place in one day after a police officer inadvertently shoots a kid. And it's the students who are all ready and full of so much anger and frustration rise up and take some of that frustration out on the gentrifiers who have created that world for them.
And that kicked off your style of writing literary fiction that is a page turner. You have to know what happens next. When you finished the novel, how did you go about getting it published? What was your path like?
So I submitted it to a dozen agents or so, and they all turned me down. And then I submitted the query letter to a dozen agents or so. They all ignored it. I then submitted the same query letter to another dozen, 11 of whom turned me down, one of whom said, "This seems interesting, would love to check it out." I forwarded her the full manuscript, and a few days later got an email saying, "I think this is fantastic. Let's give it a try." Then it was 2 years of edits with her saying, "Really, we should be changing this and this," and me being a petulant child and disagreeing and thrashing and weeping and being furious and being calmed down by my friends and wife, because that was my third full novel I had written that hadn't been published to that time. So I had spent over a decade, writing novels that weren't working out. So thank God they told me to listen to my agent. Her name is Trina Keating, and I think she's a real genius when it comes to this stuff. And she went out to 30 or so editors, 28 of which called the novel unpublishable, and sort of 1.5 were interested. And that let it be, something like an auction where my editor, Sarah Canton at H. Simon Schuster, offered a preempt in order to make sure that she got it ahead of the other editor who might have been interested, and I got a career. So it's just this stuff is so arbitrary and so based on luck. And if instead of 29 people didn't like it, 30 didn't like it, I wouldn't have had a career. But all it takes is winning the lottery twice, where you need to be in the realm where your books are publishable. But then I really do think that there are far, far more publishable books out there that are probably much better than mine, that never win that double lottery of getting the right agent and then getting the right editor from that agent. But after 10, 15 years of failing at it, I got lucky twice.
Well, it's luck and a lot of personal preference.
Exactly.
And the taste of the public are fickle, and 29 people may have said, I don't like that. It's not publishable. And then when it comes out and finds an audience, all of a sudden those
exactly.
Those things change.
Exactly.
It's funny how that works. But The ability to write a story, a gripping tale like this from that really comes out of your personal experience and the way you view the world around you, that then birthed this story. You follow this up with the new book that we're talking about today, The Body Politic, and this also came out of your personal observations of the world changing. Tell us a little bit about where The Body Politic came from.
Absolutely. So after my first novel was bought, but before it was published, I came down with a mysterious neurological disorder that doctors still don't fully understand. But for almost 2 years, I was completely debilitated. I couldn't be alone with my kids. I couldn't see out of my left eye for most of the time. I couldn't write or teach. I couldn't talk on the phone. I saw dozens of specialists all around the world with the traditional Western and holistic medicine, and nothing for those 2 years worked. And it was really miserable. It was really miserable. It was the combination of that of the daily pain and suffering of really, it felt like I woke up, 20 or 30 beers in and hungover. I just couldn't orient myself or think straight. And that combined with the existential horror of not knowing if that was going to be the rest of my life or not, it brought me to a really dark place. And I eventually, through a research scientist in Pittsburgh who had an idea and then sent me to the Mayo Clinic where I was treated for a few weeks. I'm on this cocktail of heavy medications, and people still don't know what's wrong with my brain initially. They don't know why the medications mitigate the symptoms, and they don't know why the medications lead to the side effects. But I went through this incredible dip and then somewhat recovery where I have now, because of these medications, a good 5 or 6 hours of clarity every day. And just as I was starting to feel like I could live again, like I could enjoy being with my family, and I was starting to teach, the election of Donald Trump occurred. And I understand people have different politics, and I myself am not a fan of Trump's. I know that some people are, but I saw a parallel in the discomfort and confusion and sense of dread and not knowing how long it would last and not really being able to interpret my life around me with what so many of my fellow New Yorkers were experiencing politically, where I think a lot of us saw Trump as an impossible candidate, after admitting that he sexually assaulted women and he sort of spoke in some racist ways that I again understand that people feel differently about him than I do, and I'm not at all trying to insult those people. But in New York City, you can imagine that there was a sense of the days after the election. The only thing that it reminded me of, and this sounds extreme, but I mean it, is after the attacks of 9/11, where people were walking the streets and riding the subways, almost going out of their way to be generous and kind to one another, in this sense of like, what the hell just happened, and trying to understand one's reality. And the only thing I could compare it to, other than the attacks on the World Trade Center, was this sense of what I experienced very lonely with for those years of disorientation and confusion. And of course, it was more acute with me. But then the more I spoke to psychotherapist friends who were seeing a bunch of patients who, were having trouble figuring out their lives post-election, or Hispanic friends, or less fully documented friends who were full of dread, I just felt that I could tell a story specifically about this one guy who was suffering with a neurological condition by telling the story of his wife and friends and colleagues. I could get into the head of what my wife and friends were dealing with while I was suffering for this, in a way that I was too myopic or selfish or stuck in my own brain to deal with, and then could have all of that exist within the political context of what it meant to be an American, during this time. So it enabled me to tell my personal story within the context of the public American story in a way that I was really excited by.
Well, there's for a writer, there's a couple of different ways to express those emotions and to convey that story to others. You could have written a scathing column for someone and published it somewhere, or you could do what I think is the more effective thing, and that is to couch your feelings in story and in in a group of characters that we come to care about, because that's where I think that's where people's hearts really change is not by someone preaching at you, but giving you a story that you can care about and people you can care about and see how these things kind of wash out over them. Tell us about the main characters in the book: Tess, Tazio, David, and Angelica. How did they come to you, and what do you put them through?
Absolutely. First, I want to note that it's so astute about what you were saying about writing the essay, and it was the same thing with the Bed-Stuy situation, where initially I thought, like, I'll write an op-ed for the New York Times or the Washington Post or something about the gentrification or what it's like. But I didn't have a thesis. There wasn't an easy way for me to understand what was going on. And the same thing with the current political moment and the health stuff. Like if I could in a thesis paragraph, say this is the problem and this should be the solution, that would have been much easier than writing a novel. But I agree entirely with what you're saying, that really the way that I know how to articulate my vision of the world is through depicting individuals going through life and letting a reader follow them. So the main characters of my book, there are these four characters. One of them is loosely based off me in my personal experience with the chronic illness. In my case, the illness just came on one day and we're uncertain what caused it. But in order to animate the novel and to make the story more compelling and urgent, in David's case, his symptoms came along because he found out his wife and the love of his life was unfaithful towards him. They split up for a while, and then in trying to win her back and show their two young sons that life could be fun again, he acted in sort of reckless, overly performative ways. He climbed up a big ladder and he was joking around and he fell, and that head trauma led to him experiencing a lot of the same feelings I do. And that tends to be how I write. I take a kernel of emotional truth from myself or people I know well or have met and try to build a compelling narrative where those truths aren't asked to carry the entire story. The story is exciting and thrilling, but I can tell, the emotional reality among them. So that's David, the guy who's suffering. His wife, Tess, has lived a complicated life as well. We find out early on that her father was implicated in the murder of her mother, and she grew up without parents and experiencing a variety of pain. And she became an artist, a visual artist, first a painter and then an actor, to seek an outlet. And she met her close friend Tazio at art school, and Tazio happened to be David's friend from high school. So Tazio introduced David to Tess because both David and Tess were friends of Tazio's from different parts in Tazio's life. And David and Tess fell in love, while Tazio continued to be a very good friend with David and with Tess. The final character, Angelica, comes in because she is the romantic love interest to Tazio. So you have the four main characters. David and Tess are brought together from Tazio, and Angelica is in a romantic relationship with Tazio as well.
And I love the way that there's something about the way that you write that gives us. Pardon me a second. Sorry, I had to cough. We almost get a feeling of David's ailment in the way that you write. There's something unsettling that makes us connect with him and what he's going through. Was that a conscious effort?
Absolutely. It was. And I tried to find as much fiction as I could before I sat down and and wrote, where a principal character has a chronic illness that either doesn't kill him at the end or from which he doesn't fully recover. And I'm not giving anything away to say that at this point, but there's that latent dread that is a part of chronic illness that so many, hundreds of thousands, I think millions of Americans experience, and therefore even more than millions have some interaction with those of us who experience chronic illness. And it's a combination of the acute pain and of the perception that the person in pain and those around him or her feel. So I appreciate your keying in on that, because I really tried to work hard on, yes, getting into David's head and, letting him, go through the litany of symptoms. But more than that, letting the other characters experience this degree of disorientation. And for Tazio, I think a lot of that comes from his alcoholism and his work on political campaigns, because if you spend a year or two trying to get John Edwards elected or trying to get Hillary Clinton elected, and then they're not elected, the idea of entering back into your daily life has a disorienting sense. If you've lost your parents at a young age and trying to figure out how to create, a familial love without a model, that's disorienting in its own way. So I tried to bring these characters together who could support one another through various degrees of disorientation, at the same time as trying to give the reader exciting moments where the reader is rooting for a confrontation or rooting for a sense of clarity in the characters that they themselves are so desperately searching for.
When you have a book like this where there's so much at stake and things are happening to the characters so viscerally and so deeply, it would be so easy for this book to just be 300 pages of dread. But to your credit, there are moments of levity that, but because you're talking about talking about humans here, we get to experience the whole gamut of emotions. Tell me a little bit about letting the reader off the hook every now and then, to let them breathe, and does that make people care about these characters more than just watching them, slowly go off a cliff?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing more boring and awful than spending time with someone who's chronically ill, who's just complaining over and over again, justifiably, but whose life is complaining, which is one of the reasons why I didn't write the book from the sick person's perspective. I gave him, 50 some odd pages early on so the reader would really understand the severity of it. But after that, it was important to me that I opened up the book and I made it about sex and love and art and politics and all these things that all of us can understand and experience. I mean, before I published novels, I wrote a bunch of those Shouts and Murmurs pieces for The New Yorker and McSweeney's humor pieces, which are all 750-word surreal humor pieces for the most part. And it was important to me that although definitely this book, The Body Politic, isn't humor, it was alive in some ways, where readers would see kids doing silly things or meet a character who's trying to, buy a diamond ring or trying to meet up with these people in the middle of a political campaign, where the purpose of the book is not to make the reader experience the suffering that some of the characters experience. The purpose of the book is to contextualize that suffering as one kind of life experience and to fold it into the myriad of life experiences of having kids and being a kid and raising kids and having romantic partners and cheating or being cheated on or having political desires and either those being satisfied or not and living in today. So although I definitely felt it was important to try to articulate what it feels like to suffer from a chronic illness or to spend time with somebody suffering, that to me was far more the emotional center of the book than it was the plot center, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, the book is called The Body Politic. It's available everywhere now. There's links to it in the show notes of this episode. Brian, if people are just learning about you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place online where they can
Out of him
connect
in
with
one
you?
week's time.
Absolutely. They can follow me on Twitter, which is I'm just at B Platzer, or brianplatzer.com has links to my bio, to some spoken word performances I've given, to both my novels and to almost everything else I've written for the New York Times, New York Magazine, etc.
Well, Brian, this has been so much fun talking. Thank you for such a great conversation. We're going to send everyone to see you. There's going to be links to all your great stuff in the show notes of this episode. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, this was such a treat. Thank you.
Stay tuned now for an audiobook excerpt from Richard Fox's The Ember War.
The near future. The probe slowed as the sun's heliosphere disrupted the graviton wave it rode in on from the abyss of deep space. Awakened by the sudden deceleration, the probe absorbed the electromagnetic spectrum utilized by its target species and assessed the technological sophistication of the sole sentient species on Earth. The probe adjusted its course to take it into the system's primary. If the humans couldn't survive, with its help, what was to come, then the probe would annihilate itself. There would be no trace of it for the enemy, and no chance of humanity's existence beyond the time it had until the enemy arrived. The probe analyzed filed patents, military expenditures, birth rates, mathematical advancement, and space exploration. The first assessment fell within the margin of error of survival and extinction for humanity. The probe's programming allowed for limited, autonomous decision-making, choice being a rare luxury for the probe's class of artificial intelligence. The probe found itself in a position to choose between ending its mission in the sun's fire and a mathematically improbable defense of humanity, and the potential compromise of its much larger mission. Given the rare opportunity to make its own decision, the probe opted to dither. In the week it took to pass into Jupiter's orbit, the probe took in more data. It scoured the internet for factors to add to the assessment, but the assessment remained the same. Unlikely, but possible. By the time it shot past Mars, the probe still hadn't made a decision. As the time to adjust course for Earth or continue into the Sun approached, the probe conducted a final scan of cloud storage servers for any new information, and found something interesting. While the new information made only a negligible impact on the assessment, the probe adjusted course to Earth. It hadn't traveled all this way for nothing. In the desert south of Phoenix, Arizona, it landed with no more fanfare than a slight thump and a few startled cows. Then it broke into the local cell network and made a call. Mark Ibarra awoke to his phone ringing at max volume, playing a pop ditty that he hated with vehemence. He rolled off the mattress that lay on the floor and crawled on his hands and knees to where his cell was recharging. His roommate, who paid the majority of their rent and got to sleep on an actual bed, grumbled and let off a slew of slurred insults. Mark reached his cell and slapped at it until the offending music ended. He blinked sleep from his eyes and tried to focus on the caller's name on the screen. The only people who'd call at this ungodly hour were his family in Basque country, or maybe Jessica in his applied robotics course wanted a late-night study break. The name on the screen was Answer Me. He closed an eye and reread the name. It was way too early, or too late, depending on one's point of view, for this nonsense. He turned the ringer off and went back to bed. Sleep was about to claim him when the phone rang again, just as loudly as last time, but now with a disco anthem. "Seriously?" his roommate slurred. Mark declined the call and powered the phone off. He flopped back on his bed and curled into his blanket. To hell with my first class, he thought. Arizona State University had a lax attendance policy, one which he'd abused for nights like this. The cell erupted with big band music. Mark took his head out from beneath the covers and looked at his phone like it was a thing possessed. The phone vibrated so hard that it practically danced a jig on the floor, and the screen flashed "Answer Me" over and over again as music blared. "Dude," said his roommate, now sitting up in his bed. Mark swiped the phone off the charging cord, and the music stopped. The caller's name undulated with a rainbow of colors, and an arrow appeared on the screen, pointing to the button he had to press to answer the call. When did I get this app? He thought. Mark sighed and left the bedroom, meandering into the hallway bathroom with the grace of a zombie. The battered mattress he slept on played hell with his back and left him stiff every morning. Dropping his boxers, he took a seat on the toilet and answered the call, determined to return this caller's civility with some interesting background noise. "What?" he murmured. "Mark Ibarra. I need to see you." The voice was mechanical, asexual in its monotone. "Do you have any friggin' idea what time it is? Wait, who the hell is this?" "You must come to me immediately. We must discuss the mathematical proof you have stored in document title This Can't Be Right, .doc. Mark shot to his feet. The boxers around his ankles tripped him up, and he stumbled out of the bathroom and fell against the wall. His elbow punched a hole in the drywall, and the cell clattered to the floor. He scooped the phone back up and struggled to breathe as a sudden asthma attack came over him. How? He couldn't finish his question until he found his inhaler in the kitchen, mere steps away in the tiny apartment. He took a deep breath from the inhaler and felt the tightness leave his lungs. That someone knew of his proof was impossible. He'd finished it earlier that night and had encrypted it several times before loading it into a cloud file that shouldn't have been linked to him in any way. "How do you know about that?" he asked. "You must come to me immediately. There is little time. Look at your screen," the robotic voice said. His screen changed to a map program, displaying a pin in an open field just off the highway, connecting Phoenix to the suburb of Maricopa. "Come. Now." Mark grabbed his keys. An hour later, his jeans ripped from scaling a barbed wire fence, Mark was surrounded by desert scrub. The blue of the morning rose behind him, where his beat-up Honda waited on the side of the highway. With his cell to its...
Some things you write now, do they differ in the writing process from
plants? Looked a lot like benign mesquite trees in the darkness. A Native American casino in the distance served as his North Star, helping him keep his bearings. "You're not out here, are you? I'm being punked, aren't I?" he asked the mysterious caller. "You are 9.26 meters to my east-southeast. Punk, decayed wood, used as tinder. Are you on fire?" the caller said. Mark rolled his eyes. This wasn't the first time the caller had used the non-standard meanings of words during what passed as conversation between the two. Mark had tried to get the caller to explain how he knew about his theorem and why they had to meet in the middle of the desert. The caller had refused to say anything. He would only reiterate that Mark had to come quickly to see him, chiding him every time Mark deviated from the provided driving directions. "If you're so close, why can't I see you?" he asked. He took a few steps in what he thought was a northwesterly direction and squished into a cow patty.